Nothing is happening, and yet something has already begun. The mind reaches for sound, for meaning, for movement, but none arrives. Only space, a quiet that does not comfort, a stillness that does not explain itself. You are not empty because something is missing. You are empty because something is being removed. Old weight, old noise, old ways of holding what no longer belongs. This silence feels unfamiliar because it is not meant to entertain you. It is meant to make room. The heart senses it before the mind agrees. Something is loosening. Something is stepping back. Not an ending. A clearing. Stay here, because what comes after this silence only arrives. For those who do not run from it. Lesson 1. The discomfort of silence is the first signal. The silence feels wrong. Not loud enough to resist, not gentle enough to welcome. It does not arrive with pain sharp enough to name, nor with peace clear enough to trust. It simply settles. The heart senses a gap where something familiar once lived, and that gap feels unsettling because it cannot be explained. The mind immediately searches for a cause. It looks for loss, failure, or weakness. It calls the space emptiness and reaches instinctively for noise, memory, distraction, or interpretation. But this unease is not a warning. It is not the sign of something breaking. It is the first signal that the soul has moved beyond what once held it. In ordinary life, the soul is surrounded by familiar structures, roles, desires, expectations, emotional habits, and repeated meanings give the heart a sense of orientation. Even discomfort can feel familiar if it has a name. But when the soul outgrows a structure, it does not collapse it violently. It steps out of it quietly. What remains is not destruction, but absence of sound. And absence of sound feels frightening to a mind that has learned to measure life by movement. This is why silence often feels unsettling before it feels meaningful. The mind is trained to associate quiet with loss or stagnation. It assumes that if nothing is happening, something must be wrong. But the soul does not work by urgency. It works by readiness. When it no longer needs a certain form of meaning, that meaning withdraws. The silence that follows is not empty space. It is transitional space. In the inner understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, silence appears when the soul outgrows its former language. What once spoke clearly now falls quiet, not because meaning has ended, but because it is changing form. Just as words become unnecessary between those who understand each other deeply, the soul no longer requires constant explanation when it enters a new stage of awareness. The discomfort arises because the old language has faded, but the new one has not yet emerged. The heart is suspended between what it no longer responds to and what it has not yet learned to hear. This suspension feels unstable, not because it is unsafe, but because it is unfamiliar. The soul has stepped beyond its previous boundaries, and the mind has not caught up. Many people panic. They assume the silence means they have lost faith, motivation, or direction. They try to force themselves back into old rhythms that no longer resonate. They increase noise, activity, or explanation, hoping to restore what once felt certain. But certainty cannot be revived once it has been outgrown. The soul does not regress to survive. It pauses to reorient. This is why the silence feels like standing at a threshold. Nothing behind you pulls with the same strength. Nothing ahead is visible yet. The mind interprets this as emptiness, but the soul recognizes it as crossing. The discomfort is not punishment. It is the sensation of leaving a known room before entering the next. What makes this phase particularly difficult is that it does not announce its purpose. There is no immediate reward, no reassurance, no clarity. The silence simply exists, asking to be felt rather than understood. And this is precisely why it works. The soul cannot be reshaped while it is constantly explaining itself. Silence interrupts habitual self-definition. It removes the labels the heart once relied on. In this quiet, the soul begins to sense itself without the noise of identity. It notices how much of its movement was driven by habit rather than truth. It feels the weight of what it has been carrying without realizing it. This awareness does not arrive as insight, it arrives as unease. But unease here is not danger, it is sensitivity returning. The discomfort of silence is often mistaken for emptiness of meaning, but it is actually sensitivity to meaning changing. The soul is adjusting its inner balance. Old anchors loosen, new ones have not yet settled. The heart feels exposed because it is no longer held by familiar certainties. But exposure does not collapse, it is openness forming. This is why the silence cannot be rushed. If the soul is forced to fill the space too quickly, it fills it with substitutes. Old meanings dressed in new language. Familiar desires framed as insight. But if the silence is allowed to remain, it does its work quietly. It teaches the soul how to stand without leaning on what no longer belongs. The threshold is uncomfortable because thresholds always are. They are places of passage, not rest. But they are also places of honesty. In the silence, the soul can no longer hide behind momentum. It must feel where it truly is. This feeling is raw, but it is also precise. It reveals what has ended without needing to name it. The discomfort then is not the enemy, it is the indicator. It tells you that the soul has moved further than the mind has realized. That something essential has already shifted, even if nothing visible has changed. The silence marks the moment when old forms fall quiet, making room for something deeper to take shape. What feels unsettling is often the door. Lesson 2. Emptiness is not absence, but withdrawal. As the silence settles, a second sensation follows it: emptiness. Not the dramatic emptiness of loss, but a quieter one that confuses the heart. Something has faded, yet nothing new has arrived to replace it. The mind immediately interprets this gap as lack. It assumes the soul has been emptied of meaning, purpose, or connection. But this emptiness is not absence, it is withdrawal. Withdrawal is deliberate. It is the soul stepping back from attachments that once shaped its movement. These attachments were not necessarily harmful. Many were useful, even necessary, at earlier stages. They gave direction, structure, and momentum, but what supports growth at one stage can restrict it at another. When the soul senses that an attachment can no longer accompany it forward, it does not destroy it. It withdraws its energy from it. This is why the emptiness feels exposed and unfamiliar. The soul is no longer leaning on what once held it. The support has not collapsed. It has been released. And release, when it happens quietly, feels like standing without a railing. The heart notices the space more than the freedom it creates. In the inner understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, withdrawal is an act of precision. Nothing essential is taken. Only what has completed its purpose steps away. The soul does not empty itself recklessly. It clears space intentionally, making room for a form of meaning that cannot coexist with what came before. This is difficult for the mind to accept because the mind prefers replacement. It wants the old to be immediately substituted with the new, but the soul does not move that way. It withdraws first. It creates space before it introduces depth. This gap is not a mistake in timing, it is the timing. The emptiness feels frightening because it removes reference points. The heart can no longer measure itself by familiar desires, motivations, or emotional responses. What once excited no longer moves it. What once comforted no longer satisfies it. The mind labels this as loss, but the soul recognizes it as refinement. Refinement always feels like reduction before it feels like expansion. The soul is being stripped of excess weight, not punishment, but preparation. This is why the emptiness feels precise rather than chaotic. There is no collapse. Life continues. Responsibilities remain, but inwardly, something has stepped back, leaving a clean, quiet space. This space is often misunderstood as stagnation, but stagnation is heavy and resistant. This emptiness is light and open, even if it feels unsettling. The soul is not stuck, it is unburdened. What feels like nothing is actually possibility without form. The fear arises when the mind tries to fill the space prematurely. It rushes to old habits, explanations, or distractions, hoping to restore a sense of fullness. But filling the space too quickly only delays the work being done. The soul is not asking to be filled, it is asking to be left open long enough for something truer to arrive. Withdrawal also reveals attachment more clearly. When something steps away, the heart notices how much it relied on it. This noticing is not meant to create regret, it is meant to create honesty. The soul learns what it was leaning on without realizing it. This awareness is essential for the next stage, because what the soul does not recognize, it cannot release fully. This is why emptiness can feel vulnerable. Without attachments, the soul stands exposed. There is no buffer, no distraction, no familiar identity to hide behind. But vulnerability here is not weakness. It is sincerity. The soul is meeting itself without the coverings it once used to feel secure. The space left behind is not dead. It is alive with potential. But potential does not announce itself. It waits. It remains undefined until the soul is ready to receive it without distortion. If something new were to enter too soon, it would be interpreted through old attachments. The emptiness prevents this confusion. Withdrawal also protects the soul from settling too quickly. If the old attachments remained, the soul would continue moving in familiar patterns, mistaking movement for growth. By withdrawing energy from what no longer fits, the soul prevents false continuity. It interrupts repetition. It creates the conditions for genuine transformation. This is why the emptiness can feel lonely even when surrounded by people. The soul is no longer nourished by what once sustained it, and it has not yet found what will. This loneliness is not social. It is existential. It reflects a shift in inner orientation rather than external circumstances. The important thing to understand is that emptiness is not asking to be feared. It is asking to be respected. It marks a boundary between stages. It signals that something has ended cleanly, without rupture, and that the soul is now standing in a space where it must learn to receive differently. The withdrawal will not last forever, but it must last long enough for the soul to adjust to standing without old supports, long enough for the heart to become honest about what it no longer needs, long enough for the space to become stable rather than threatening. Only then can something new arrive without being forced. What has stepped away did so because it could not stay. What remains is space because space is required. Lesson 3. When meaning stops speaking, perception begins. After withdrawal settles and the emptiness stabilizes, a subtler change takes place. The soul notices that meaning no longer announces itself. The familiar inner commentary grows quiet. Questions lose urgency. Interpretations that once came automatically now hesitate, as if waiting for permission. This can feel disorienting, because much of the soul's sense of orientation has been built on explanation. Meaning used to arrive in words, in clear feelings, in recognizable signals. Now it does not. This silence of meaning can feel like confusion. The mind assumes that if meaning is not speaking, it must have disappeared, but meaning has not vanished. It has changed its mode of presence. What has ended is not meaning itself, but the habit of being told what things mean. The soul is no longer being guided through commentary, it is being guided through perception. Perception is quieter than meaning. It does not explain itself. It does not insist, "I noticed." In the inner understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, there are stages where the soul moves beyond interpretation into witnessing. At these stages, meaning no longer arrives dressed in language. It arrives as an immediacy, as a subtle knowing that does not need to be spoken. The soul begins to sense rather than define. This shift is delicate because the mind has been trained to rely on explanation for reassurance. When meaning stops speaking, the mind feels exposed. Without words, it cannot grasp. Without labels, it cannot categorize. But the soul does not need to grasp in order to know. It needs to be present long enough for perception to sharpen. This is why the silence deepens rather than resolves quickly. The soul is learning to listen without expecting sound. Perception begins when the soul notices without reaching. It observes inner movements without trying to manage them. Feelings arise and pass without immediate interpretation. Thoughts appear without being chased. The soul becomes aware of its own inner weather without naming every shift. This awareness is not passive, it is attentive, it is awake without being tense. The soul may feel less emotional, but more sensitive. It reacts less, but perceives more. Small things are noticed that once passed unseen. The tone of a moment, the weight of a word, the subtle alignment or misalignment of an inner response. These perceptions do not demand action, they simply register. And in registering, they orient the soul more accurately than explanation ever could. This is why words lose urgency. It is not because understanding has diminished. It is because understanding no longer depends on narration. The soul no longer needs to talk itself into clarity. It recognizes clarity as it forms. This recognition feels quieter than insight, but it is steadier. It is not exciting. It settles. Many people misunderstand this phase and try to force meaning back into speech. They search for interpretations, symbols, or external confirmation. But forcing explanations disrupts perception. It pulls the soul back into analysis, which belongs to an earlier stage. At this point, analysis is less helpful than presence. The soul must learn to trust what it notices without immediately translating it. Perception also brings honesty. Without the buffer of explanation, the soul cannot hide from what it senses. It notices where something feels heavy, even if it looks correct. It notices where something feels light, even if it cannot be justified. This honesty can be uncomfortable because it bypasses social conditioning and personal narratives, but it is precise. It aligns the soul with what is true rather than what is familiar. This is where discernment begins to form naturally, not as judgment but as resonance. The soul feels what belongs and what does not without needing reasons. This resonance is subtle but reliable. It is not an emotional impulse, it is a quiet alignment. The soul recognizes when something fits its current depth and when it does not. Perception also slows time. Without constant interpretation, moments feel longer, fuller. The soul is no longer rushing to extract meaning, it is inhabiting experience directly. This directness brings a different kind of intimacy with life. The soul feels closer to what is happening, even as it reacts less. This paradox often confuses people. They assume closeness requires intensity, but intensity is often a sign of friction. Perception brings closeness without friction. The soul is present without being pulled. It witnesses without being consumed. This presence is the foundation for deeper transformation because it allows the soul to remain stable while change unfolds. When meaning stops speaking, the soul also becomes less dependent on certainty. It no longer demands conclusions. It allows ambiguity to exist without anxiety. This tolerance for not knowing is not indifference. It is maturity. The soul understands that clarity emerges in its own time, and that forcing it only distorts what is forming. Understanding forms without effort, like vision adjusting after darkness. At first, shapes are unclear. Then, gradually, without strain, things become visible. The soul does not decide to understand. Understanding happens as a result of sustained presence. This is why perception cannot be rushed. It develops through staying, through remaining with what is present without trying to resolve it prematurely. The soul learns to trust that what needs to be seen will reveal itself when the inner noise has settled enough to allow it. When perception takes root, the soul becomes less dependent on external validation. It no longer needs constant reassurance that it is on the right path. It senses alignment internally. This sensing is quiet but firm. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it simply knows. Meaning then has not disappeared, it has descended. It has moved from speech into sight, from explanation into awareness, from noise into depth. And in this depth, the soul begins to understand without words. Seeing begins where explanation ends. Lesson 4: surrender is the moment the space stops resisting. After perception settles and the soul grows accustomed to quiet seeing, a deeper shift unfolds. The silence no longer feels like something to endure. The emptiness no longer feels like something to escape. Instead, the heart notices a subtle tension, easing the tension of resistance. Until now, even in stillness, something inside has been bracing itself, waiting for explanation, outcome, or relief. Surrender begins when that bracing relaxes. Surrender here is often misunderstood. It is not giving up, and it is not resignation. It is recognition. The soul recognizes that the space it has been standing in is not an error in its journey, but a movement within it. The pause is not blocking the path. It is shaping the one who will walk it next. When this recognition arrives, the inner struggle to define, fix, or justify the silence fades. This is the moment the space stops resisting. Resistance is subtle. It does not always feel like conflict. Often it feels like quiet impatience, low-grade anxiety, or the constant sense that something should already be different. The soul may accept the silence intellectually while still pressing against it inwardly. Surrender happens when the soul no longer asks the silence to explain itself. It allows the pause to exist without conditions. In the inner understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, surrender is not passive submission to circumstances, but alignment with the deeper movement of reality. The soul stops positioning itself against what is unfolding and instead rests within it. This resting does not require understanding, it requires trust without proof. When surrender arrives, the texture of silence changes. It no longer feels dense or heavy. It becomes open, breathable. The soul notices that the same space that once felt oppressive now feels wide. Nothing external has changed. The difference is internal. The soul is no longer pushing against what is present, and without that pressure, the space reveals a gentler quality. This shift is often quiet enough to be missed. There is no dramatic relief, no sudden clarity. The heart simply stops tightening. The inner dialogue softens. The need to move dissolves. The soul rests without knowing why it is allowed to rest. This rest is not sleep. It is presence without tension. Surrender also changes the relationship to time. Before, the silence felt endless, as though something had stalled. After surrender, time feels less threatening. The soul no longer measures the pause by duration. It inhabits it. Waiting no longer feels like delay. It feels like participation in a process that cannot be rushed. At this stage, the soul begins to understand that resistance was never protecting it. Resistance was exhausting it. The effort to control or escape the silence was the source of much of the discomfort. Once that effort falls away, the silence reveals itself as neutral, neither enemy nor reward. Simply a field in which something deeper is taking shape. This does not mean all unease disappears, but unease is no longer amplified by fear. The soul allows uncertainty to exist without treating it as a threat. This allowance is powerful because it returns agency to the soul without demanding action. The soul is no longer fighting the space, it is inhabiting it. Surrender also dissolves the need for constant self-reference. The soul stops asking, "What does this say about me?" or "Where am I failing?" These questions belong to a stage where identity is still being negotiated. In surrender, identity loosens. The soul becomes less concerned with how it appears to itself and more attuned to how it is being shaped. This is why surrender often feels humbling, not humiliating, but grounding. The soul realizes it does not need to manage every phase of its own becoming. Some transformations require participation through stillness rather than effort. Surrender acknowledges this truth without argument. When surrender settles, the space begins to feel trustworthy, not because it explains itself, but because the soul no longer demands explanation. Trust forms without reasoning. The heart rests in the knowledge that it is not lost, even if it does not know where it is going. This trust is quiet, but it is firm. There is also a subtle sense of safety that emerges. The soul senses that it is being held by an order larger than its understanding. This does not eliminate uncertainty, but it removes panic from it. Uncertainty becomes spacious rather than threatening. The soul can remain open without fear of collapse. Surrender also marks the end of force. The soul no longer tries to extract meaning from silence. It allows meaning to approach when it is ready. This patience is not learned. It arises naturally when resistance dissolves. The soul recognizes that forcing clarity would only distort what is forming. This stage often feels like a long exhale, not relief exactly, but release. The soul releases the need to know. It releases the demand for progress. It releases the belief that movement must always be visible. In releasing these assumptions, the soul becomes receptive in a deeper way. What follows surrender is not immediate change, but reorientation. The soul is no longer positioned against the silence, it is aligned with it. This alignment allows the next phase to emerge without strain. Transformation no longer needs to push its way in, it is already underway. Surrender does not end the space, it changes how the space is lived. The pause remains, but it no longer feels adversarial. The silence becomes a companion rather than an obstacle. The soul understands that it has entered a deeper rhythm, one that does not obey urgency. The space stops resisting because the soul stops resisting it. Lesson 5. Inner direction reorients without instruction. After surrender settles, something begins to shift that is difficult to describe because it does not announce itself. There are no signs to follow, no inner voice giving commands, no sudden clarity that explains what comes next. Yet the soul senses movement. Not forward in the way the mind expects, but inward, like a quiet turning that happens beneath awareness. This reorientation does not feel like a decision, it feels like alignment. The soul is not choosing a direction, it is finding itself already turned. What once pulled strongly begins to lose gravity. What once felt urgent now feels distant. The soul does not argue with these changes, it notices them as facts, not conclusions. In the inner understanding associated with Ibn Arabi, Direction is not always given through instruction. Often it is given through reordering. The soul's inner compass adjusts itself when interference falls away. Silence clears the static. Withdrawal removes distortion. Surrender dissolves resistance. What remains is orientation without explanation. This is why the shift can feel unsettling at first. The mind wants a path it can recognize, a future it can imagine, a meaning it can articulate. But the soul is no longer oriented by projection, it is oriented by fit. Things feel closer or farther not because of logic, but because of resonance. The soul recognizes what belongs to its current depth and what does not. Old desires often feel strangely hollow, not disappointing, just distant. They no longer call with the same authority. This does not mean the soul has rejected them. It means they no longer define movement. The soul is not resisting desire. It is simply not being led by it. Something quieter has taken its place. This quiet leadership does not rush. It does not push the soul into action. It steadies it. The heart begins to rest in a sense of not yet without anxiety. Waiting feels different now. It is no longer suspenseful. It is participatory. The soul feels that it is already moving, even while remaining still. Reorientation also brings a subtle shift in attention. The soul stops scanning the horizon for signs and starts noticing what is already present. Small alignments become visible. Subtle misalignments become uncomfortable. The soul does not judge these sensations. It registers them the way the body registers balance without instruction. This is why clarity has not yet arrived in words. Words would be premature. The soul is still adjusting its inner posture. To receive direction too early would force it back into interpretation. The soul needs time to inhabit its new orientation before it can translate it into understanding. Many people mistake this phase for stagnation because nothing outward changes. Life continues as before, but inwardly the soul has shifted its center of gravity. What once felt central now feels peripheral. What once felt peripheral begins to feel essential. This shift is not dramatic enough to announce itself, but it is decisive. Reorientation also affects how the soul relates to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels threatening. It feels spacious. The soul is not lost. It is unbound. It no longer needs to know where it is going to trust that it is going somewhere true. This trust is not confidence. It is calm. The soul becomes less interested in outcomes and more attuned to integrity. It senses when something aligns with its inner posture and when it does not. This sensing is immediate and non-verbal. The soul feels settled around what is right and restless around what is not, without constructing reasons. This is why instruction is unnecessary here. Instructions belong to a stage where the soul needs guidance from outside itself. Reorientation belongs to a stage where guidance arises from within alignment. The soul does not need to be told where to go when it is already facing the right direction. This inward turning is gentle. It does not break habits suddenly. It loosens them. The soul may still participate in familiar patterns, but without attachment. Over time, participation fades naturally. Not because of discipline, but because of fit. What no longer fits falls away without resistance. Reorientation also brings humility. The soul realizes that much of what it once pursued was shaped by momentum rather than truth. This realization does not come with regret, it comes with relief. The soul no longer needs to justify its past or defend its future. It stands where it is, oriented differently. This phase can feel quiet to the point of invisibility. Nothing to report, nothing to explain. And yet, it is one of the most decisive movements on the inner path. The soul is being aimed, not by force, not by command, but by resonance. When direction finally becomes visible later, it will feel obvious rather than surprising. The soul will recognize it not as something new, but as something it was already facing. This is the gift of reorientation without instruction. It prepares the soul to move without confusion when movement resumes. For now, the shift continues silently. The soul settles into its new posture. It does not rush to act. It does not demand confirmation. It allows alignment to complete itself. The heart is turning, even if the world looks the same. Lesson 6: transformation happens where no one is watching. By the time the soul reaches this phase, it no longer expects change to announce itself. There is no anticipation of signs, no waiting for confirmation, no sense that something dramatic must occur for transformation to be real. What unfolds now does so quietly, almost invisibly, in places the mind rarely looks. This is where the deepest work happens outside attention, beyond effort, and without witnesses. Transformation at this level does not feel like becoming something new. It feels like shedding something that was never essential. The soul notices that certain inner tensions are no longer present, but it cannot point to when they disappeared. Old reactions soften, old fears lose their sharpness, old patterns no longer feel compelling. Nothing has been confronted directly, yet everything has shifted. This is unsettling for a mind trained to measure growth through visible milestones. The mind wants progress to be recognizable, it wants effort to be rewarded with clarity, but the soul has moved beyond that economy. Here, change is not produced by striving, it is revealed through absence. The soul becomes different because it is no longer carrying what once shaped it. In the inner understanding associated with Ibn Arabi, the most profound transformations occur in concealment, not because they are secret, but because they cannot survive exposure to ego. If transformation were obvious while it was happening, the self would try to claim it, shape it, or control it. Concealment protects the work from interference. This is why this phase often feels uneventful. Life continues. The outer world does not respond with affirmation. Others may not notice any difference at all. Yet inwardly, the soul has changed its relationship to time, meaning, and identity. It no longer moves from the same center. Its gravity has shifted. One of the clearest signs of this hidden transformation is a change in how the soul experiences pressure. Situations that once demanded reaction no longer carry the same force. The soul does not feel stronger in a dramatic sense. It feels steadier. There is less internal resistance, less argument with what is. This steadiness is not resignation, it is capacity. Another sign is the quiet disappearance of urgency. The soul no longer feels compelled to arrive somewhere else to feel whole. The need to prove, to fix, or to explain diminishes. Not because the soul has given up, but because it has settled into a deeper rhythm. It no longer measures itself by speed or outcome. Transformation here also alters memory. The past loses its authority without being erased. Old experiences no longer define the present. They are remembered without being relived. The soul carries them lightly, as part of a larger landscape rather than as anchors. This lightness is not forgetfulness, it is integration. The silence that once felt uncomfortable now holds the soul gently. It becomes a familiar depth rather than an unsettling gap. The soul can rest in it without fear of disappearing. This is significant because fear of disappearance is what drives much of human striving. When that fear loosens, the soul no longer needs to perform its existence. This phase is often mistaken for stagnation because it lacks visible motion. But still, water can be deep. The soul is reorganizing itself beneath awareness, aligning inner structures that cannot be adjusted through conscious effort. Trying to intervene here would only disrupt the balance being formed. Transformation also expresses itself through subtle restraint. The soul becomes less reactive, not because it is indifferent, but because it has learned discernment. It no longer responds to everything. It chooses where to invest its attention without deliberation. This selectivity is natural, not imposed. Another quiet shift occurs in how the soul relates to certainty. It no longer demands it. Ambiguity becomes tolerable. Questions can exist without immediate answers. This tolerance is not confusion, it is spaciousness. The soul understands that not all clarity arrives in the same form, and that some truths unfold only through time. What makes this phase particularly powerful is that it cannot be imitated. It does not respond to technique. It cannot be rushed or replicated. It happens only when the soul has passed through silence, withdrawal, perception, surrender, and reorientation. Each stage prepares the conditions for this hidden work to complete itself. Because no one is watching, the soul is free from comparison. It no longer measures itself against others' progress or narratives. Its transformation is its own. This autonomy is essential. Without it, the soul would adjust itself to expectations rather than truth. The absence of witnesses also removes pressure. There is no audience to satisfy, no role to perform. The soul can change honestly without needing to explain itself. This honesty allows transformation to reach places that self-conscious effort cannot touch. The soul realizes that what has changed is not something it gained, but something it no longer carries. The weight is gone, the noise is gone, the need to constantly assert or defend has faded. What remains is presence quiet, grounded, unremarkable, and deeply stable. This is why the transformation does not announce itself. Announcement belongs to beginnings. Completion settles quietly. The soul does not celebrate, it rests. Later, when movement returns, it will emerge from this new center. Actions will feel simpler, choices will feel cleaner, not because the soul knows more, but because it carries less. This is the gift of transformation that happens where no one is watching. The silence did not distract the soul. It rearranged it. Lesson 7: the space remains, but you do not. When the silence finally begins to loosen, something unexpected is revealed. The space does not disappear, it does not close, it does not return to what it was before. Instead, it remains quiet, open, and present, but the one who once felt lost inside it is no longer there in the same way. The soul has passed through, and in doing so, it has changed its position within itself. This can be difficult to notice because the world around you looks unchanged. Life continues. People speak the same way. Days move forward as they always have. But inwardly, something subtle has shifted. The fear that once hovered around silence is gone. The urge to fill every pause has softened. The soul no longer treats emptiness as a threat. It recognizes it as depth. The space remains because it is not an obstacle. It is a dimension the soul has learned to inhabit. What has changed is your relationship to it. Earlier, the silence felt like something you were trapped inside. Now, it feels like something you carry. It has become internalized, woven into the fabric of awareness rather than standing in front of you as an unknown. This is one of the quiet signs of completion. The soul no longer stands opposite the space, trying to understand it or survive it. It moves within it naturally. Silence becomes familiar, not because it is explained, but because it is no longer resisted. The soul has learned that it does not disappear when sound fades. It remains. In the inner understanding associated with Ibn Arabi, this marks a deep shift in identity. The self that once depended on movement, affirmation, and constant inner narration loosens its grip. A quieter self takes its place, one that does not need to announce its presence to feel real. The soul becomes less occupied with proving that it exists and more grounded in simply being. This does not result in withdrawal from life. It results in a different quality of engagement. The soul returns to action without urgency. It speaks without over-explaining. It listens without preparing responses. It rests without guilt. These changes are subtle, but they are consistent. They reveal that the center from which life is being lived has changed. The space also becomes a place the soul can return to, not as retreat, but as grounding. When life becomes noisy again, when emotions rise or demands press in, the soul remembers the silence it passed through. It knows how to step back internally without abandoning responsibility. The space becomes an inner refuge, not an escape. What makes this stage profound is that the soul does not cling to space. It does not try to remain silent forever. It allows sound to return. It allows movement to resume. But it carries the stillness within those movements. Silence becomes a background rather than a destination. This is how the soul matures. It no longer moves between extremes, noise and emptiness, certainty and confusion. It learns to hold depth while participating in form. Space does not remove you from the world. It changes how you belong to it. The self that feared disappearance has dissolved. In its place is a quieter presence that does not need constant reassurance. This presence is not detached. It is attentive. It is not passive. It is responsive without being reactive. The soul has learned the difference. Often, this stage brings humility. Not the humility of smallness, but the humility of proportion. The soul recognizes that it is part of something vast and ordered, and that it does not need to control that order to trust it. This recognition brings ease. The burden of self-management lightens. There is also a subtle gratitude that emerges not for answers, but for depth. The soul does not thank the silence for explaining itself. It thanks it for transforming the one who entered it. The silence did not teach lessons. It altered perception. The soul may look back and realize that the space it once feared was never empty. It was simply unoccupied by noise. What felt like nothing was actually the condition required for something essential to rearrange itself. The space did not take anything away. It revealed what was never necessary to begin with. This is why the space remains. It is not meant to be escaped or closed. It is meant to be known. Once known, it becomes part of the soul's landscape. It no longer interrupts life. It deepens it. You move forward carrying less, seeing more, and needing fewer explanations. The silence has done its work without announcing completion. It has not left you with certainty. It has left you with steadiness. The space remains. But you are no longer who entered it. If you have reached this place, do not look for proof that something has changed. The deepest shifts leave no marks the mind can measure. What matters is not what you understood, but what no longer feels heavy. This space did not appear to empty you. It appeared to free you from what you were never meant to carry forever. You were not asked to conquer it or explain it only to remain long enough for it to do its work. When you return to movement, you will not return the same. Something quieter will guide you, something lighter will hold you, and you may not notice it at first. But one day, in the middle of ordinary life, you will realize you no longer fear the silence. And that is how you know the transformation has already happened.